Futures trading involves risk and is not suitable for all investors. Content provided in this segment is meant for educational purposes and is not a solicitation to buy or sell commodities.
Hi, it's Steve and Joe from Fresh Agenda Everegg's Global Insights team. And Steve, we're back with some market updates, a little bit of a rundown on GDT auction number 378, and of course, the chart of the week.
Let's just go around some of the market changes leading up to this GDT event, starting with whole milk powder in New Zealand, a little bit firmer in the last week after a period where there wasn't a lot of change. If we look as well at New Zealand skim milk powder futures, that did lift quite appreciably in the prior week, firm through to the third quarter 25. Maybe an expectation that there's a bit of an impact of drought in New Zealand, or New Zealand product will have a better access to markets. Who knows? But that's certainly a firmer signal there. But staying with S&P and in Europe, it's gone the other direction, drifting weaker. There's certainly more availability, and skim milk concentrate prices have fallen steadily over the last few weeks. But I think the stronger euro is having more of an impact here, Joe, that pushing down the competitiveness of EU product with a much weaker dollar.
Just turning to the CME and non-fat dry milk futures, Steve, they did drift a little weaker despite a slightly stronger spot market. We've had some news that would have hit the market last week around what's happening with stocks, which have built quite considerably in early 2025 with very little increase in production. So that implies that demand within the US is extremely weak. And with the hangover of those very high prices, there wasn't much export interest either for US product. That will probably change in the next little while, though, Steve. And just turning to cheese, cheese in the US has strengthened. There was a stronger spot market that we saw last week, and also that carried through a bit to the futures market. There is a healthy premium to carry for a fairly distressed cash market, at least in the short term. That's with a weaker US dollar, and a much bigger short-term discount to European mozzarella at the moment, Steve. So that's probably what's driving that.
We'll talk more about that soon.
Sure. And turning back to Europe, we've been tracking the sort of up and down movements of buttercream and spot milk for quite some time. We're just seeing cream weakening again. Spot milk prices in some of those major regions like the Netherlands and Germany have now dropped under 50 euro cents a kilogram. So just seeing the market just backing off there, aren't we, Steve?
Yeah, when you look at futures, you can certainly see that.
Yeah, look, again, EX butter futures certainly weaker. There's the increasing threat of supply from Ireland, a bit more product around, bit of a blowback from US tariffs, certainly, because that's been a very strong market, particularly for Irish butter over 2024. And of course, the weaker cream prices are just reducing the butter values at the moment.
Easter will be interesting to watch.
It certainly will.
So crossing to the GDT result that came in last night, the index was 1.6% higher. A lot of action in the detail though. Let's start on the left-hand side of this whole milk powder. New Zealand whole milk powder regular went up an average 2.5%. Stronger in the second period contract. EU prices also lifted in US dollar terms, nearly 3%, but they were actually 2% weaker in euros. And we're going to be repeating this theme that there's a strong change in the currency rate, which has certainly affected this and certainly puffed up some of the index result here with the conversion of EU prices from euros. The skimmer powder was firmer, slightly firmer. Small product losses in the EU product offering in euros, but they lifted obviously in US dollars. And we can people should ignore the overall average for skim because it included the freakish changes in price in UHT product, which was a correction, a reversal of the huge gains last week, that sticky thumb or sticky finger issue we saw on a keyboard, perhaps. So that's gone into the skim average, so you really need to look below the lid here. New Zealand butter was mixed, as you can see. AMF, though, up 2.5%. Just closing a discount a little, Joe, the one you like to pull up, which is always interesting, but AMF is certainly starting. It's been on a roll for a little while now. And cheddar, also a little weaker in the earlier contracts. Looking at things we can line up when we look at these different origins, you can see there that small change in New Zealand butter, but the European butter looked really good. It was, however, very small change in the underlying price, again, US dollar conversion. Mozzarella was also a small change, a minimal impact really. I think a slight decline in mozzarella prices in euros. That translated to nearly 5% gain in prices, and that gets interesting when we compare across regions. You can see that the comparison to the cheddar prices in New Zealand.
Yeah, and just looking now at the demand to supply ratio, Steve, and really better than average demand across the board in the first 6 rounds. Very strong demand in butter, and that's been a feature of quite a few of the last few GDT auctions. Whole milk powder also stood out this week with very strong demand compared to that average.
Yeah, and this almost beckons the one of my favorite charts when you look at the round by round demand, because the whole milk price movement was quite small compared to that demand. But I've resisted the temptation, and we won't put that chart up. So, Joe, what do you reckon was behind this?
There was pretty good involvement from China, accounted for close to half of the volume on offer this time around, but pretty flat in terms of the tonnages that they've bought over the last few auctions, Steve. And then just looking at the Middle East, whole milk powder buying remains pretty weak, and that's kind of the usual modus operandi, isn't it, Steve? As these prices increase, the Middle East tends to pull back a bit.
Yeah, skimmer powder was firmer later. Not much change at the second period contract, but certainly stronger later. And when we look at different origins, there are small increases in all regions. The EU prices look stronger, but again, the weaker US dollar, the prices in Europe, however, were quite a bit weaker in euros. The Solaric product was down 3.5% in local currency, consistent, Joe, with what happened in the futures market, I guess.
Sure.
In terms of buying of skim, both major regions pulled back. We saw Chinese involvement slip below a quarter and Southeast Asian buying steady. The volumes were flat, but on similar volumes to the last event. So no action there. Where does this leave us, Joe?
Well, when we look across the futures markets and this latest GDT event, New Zealand premium widened a little bit for skim milk powder, but EU prices have lifted in US dollars, as you've said. That's effectively narrowed the gap, particularly in the short term.
Gets interesting later, doesn't it?
It certainly does. And just looking at butter and that comparison, EU prices push a little higher with the stronger currency. Those futures still well above the GDT results from this week.
Brings New Zealand AMF back into play, I think, a little bit, where that European market is.
Yeah, and just looking at what the cheese market is facing, I guess. We talked earlier about the opportunity that there is, at least in the very short term, for the US market with much lower prices compared to EU mozzarella. This is a chart of cheddar futures against the projected fundamental values from our global dairy directions analysis, Steve. You can see there's a pretty big discount in the very short term, but that's very quickly eroded as we go forward.
Below a level where practice has shown US is successful at lifting shares.
That's right, yeah.
And here's a different view of that, which is more of a spot view, but just comparing where, the US market in terms of spot prices was drifting weak, and this is probably an NDPSR price. New Zealand cheddar's been steady and been high, relatively high for some time, but that GDT value is lifting strongly and helped by a weaker US dollar. So that's going to be an interesting influence over time. That gap between the black line and the green has widened out to some of the highest we've seen for a while. So, Joe, how will you bring us home with the chart of the week?
Yeah, look, we're going across to Europe now, Steve, and we just got the European February milk production data, and it's a fairly big drop of 2%, leap year adjusted in terms of production there. We're probably seeing those blue tongue virus outbreaks that we were expecting with the warmer weather really starting to bite. So Germany down 3.3% for the month, France down 4%, and Belgium down a significant 9.6%. And Ireland, after a couple of really good months of growth against pretty poor comparatives, was also down 3.6%. Poland is the only one of the majors that continues to keep on keeping on, growing at about 1.7% for the month. But that's a fairly sharp downturn there, Steve.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to watch this. As you said, we really haven't seen the warm weather effects of that disease, but there is very high coal prices for cows.
Mhm.
That's probably not in these numbers. That's something that's happened after this. But also the consequence of the disease on productivity and herd numbers are certainly behind this.
Yeah.
So not good prospects for spring.
No, another data point for the market to digest, Steve. And I guess before we finish up, we wanted to give a quick update for our very large numbers of
Large.
yes, YouTube subscribers. Starting in the last week of April, our weekly take videos will be hosted on the ever.ag YouTube channel. So if you're subscribed to the Fresh Agenda channel at the moment, make sure you go to subscribe to EverAg's channel. That's ever.ag on YouTube so that you won't miss any of our new content.
How could you afford to miss it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's all from us this week. We'll be back again next week. Thanks for watching.